Thanks everyone for coming and joining, even though it's a super warm day. We've got Alex with us from Ocean Conservancy today. So I think most people here are probably from the academic space. It'd be super interesting to hear your perspective from an NGO. So I'll pass over to Alex now to talk about Central Arctic Ocean governance.
Great. Thank you, Lucy. Let me just share.
Oh yeah, and we'll have about 40 minutes ish of talk and then time for Q&A afterwards. But feel free to use the chat.
Cool. And just confirming that my screen is sharing. Great. Well, yeah, thanks again. I'm really pleased to have a chance to speak with all of you and get to provide the seminar to the UK Polar Network. As Lucy mentioned, my name is Alex Shabhazi. I'm Senior Manager of Arctic Programs at Ocean Conservancy. And the primary role that I play is I help lead our efforts in the Central Arctic Ocean. We have been working in the CAO for a long time, working on science, Indigenous knowledge, and then policy to inform conservation. So I'm really excited to talk about this space. I know I talk about it a lot, and so I may say things that you might already know because I also know I'm talking to a polar scientist audience. So apologies if I say something that you know, but sometimes I forget what I know and other people don't know. So there might be some good information here for some folks to learn a bit more, hopefully. And then just a quick little overview of what I'll be going through today. I'll be talking about the CAO. I'll try to talk a lot about the science, but I will talk a bit about the policy and the governance too, although I'll try not to make it a full policy talk since that's certainly the realm that I tend to work in a bit more. But really talking about some of the important aspects of where science, policy, and Indigenous knowledge overlap in the Central Arctic Ocean. So a key part of that is the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, which I will talk about. And then I'll also talk about the additional governance gaps and ways that scientists are helping lead the way, way that scientists have already helped lead the way, and crucially, ways that scientists can continue to help lead the way in building good governance and good research that incorporates science and Indigenous knowledge in the CAO. So to quickly position ourselves of what the Central Arctic Ocean is, there are several definitions of the Central Arctic Ocean. The one that we work with the most and the one that you'll tend to see the most is a completely arbitrary political and border definition. So all countries have a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, which is set out by a very robust United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And any space of ocean outside of those 200 nautical miles is considered high seas. So when you add up all of the different exclusive economic zones, or EEZs or EEZs, of the 5 Arctic coastal states, you do get this roughly Mediterranean Sea-sized portion of high seas centered around a little off the North Pole, but centered at the top of our planet. This is what we tend to work with because it is, when we talk about governance gaps, it is a massive governance gap since it is outside of national jurisdiction. But you might also see something called the Central Arctic Ocean Large Marine Ecosystem. This is an ecological definition that's often used in the Arctic Council's working groups, and it does overlap mostly with the high seas portion, although notably areas like the Chukchi Plateau right here, which is continental crust, is not included in that large marine ecosystem definition, and some of these more open abyssal deep sea areas are included as well. But oftentimes those still do overlap a lot. And while this is a really good map to position us and sort of say where the Central Arctic Ocean is, it of course is not descriptive of what it actually looks like up there, because for most of human history, the Central Arctic Ocean has been covered in meters thick sea ice. In the summer and the winter, that sea ice has been present up until just a couple of decades ago. So for most of the people that I still tend to work with, this was called permanent sea ice at the beginning of their careers. The CAO has been locked up and was essentially non-accessible from any type of vessel traffic. So you see the expeditions of traversing across the sea ice and effectively acted as land up there. But as we all know, unfortunately, sea ice has been changing rapidly. The September sea ice extent in the Central Arctic Ocean has diminished. And we are predicting, or scientists have predicted, that there could be the first summer without sea ice in the CAO within the next 10 to 20 years. And notably, it's not a uniform thaw and refreeze in the CAO. It tends to open up over here by Alaska and Western Canada. That's important to note, something we talk about in a couple slides. But as the CAO is losing sea ice, it is causing drastic impacts. A couple other examples, it's not just sea ice extent, it is sea ice thickness, which is really crucial when it comes to some of the ecosystems that rely on thicker sea ice. And sea ice volume is going down as well. And it does impact the Arctic ecosystems, and I'll talk about that in a second. But I think something that we talk a lot about at Ocean Conservancy with our partners as well, especially thinking about communicating the Arctic and science in the Arctic to a global audience, is the impacts that the Arctic have on the rest of the planet. So sea ice in the Arctic has been very closely linked to climates in the lower latitudes, specifically when it comes to extreme weather. So the maintenance of the polar vortex, I'm from the US, and so we oftentimes get once every couple of years the polar vortex coming down. The stability of that polar vortex is linked to the sea ice. Sometimes folks in India we've talked to are concerned about the sea ice in the Arctic because of its impacts on the monsoon season there too. So the Central Arctic Ocean is far away from people, most people in the planet, but it is closely linked to a lot of folks around the world. Not just through the sea ice, though. Of course, it's also linked through currents. The Central Arctic Ocean, right here in the center, is connected through the Bering Strait and the Fram Strait to the rest of the global oceans. So what happens again in the CAO doesn't stay there. And as sea ice is declining and impacting ecosystems and people around the world, it of course is ravaging ecosystems in the Arctic itself. Many species, from plankton that hug the underside of sea ice to megafauna like you see here, are crucially rely on that sea ice and are finding it much harder to persist in the same numbers as before. It's important to talk about species when we think about the Arctic, but one of the main things that we do at Ocean Conservancy is focusing on the people in the Arctic and specifically indigenous communities. Indigenous communities have been in the Arctic for over 30,000 years, and they rely on the sea ice very similarly to how the species and ecosystems rely on the sea ice. These are communities that intrinsically rely on subsistence hunting of of marine mammals like walruses and whales. And so when we see these rapid changes to the ecosystems, of course, they are being impacted as well. And while you might think that, yeah, 200 nautical miles, that's far away, and it is true that indigenous communities don't hunt directly in the Central Arctic Ocean. If you see here, this is a map of the different indigenous language branches around the circumpolar Arctic. This is the backyard, or as some indigenous peoples that we've spoken with, it's their front yard. We have worked with some folks in the Inuvialuit settlement region of Western Canada, right here, and the belugas that they track, they see it going into the Central Arctic Ocean and back out. Just because it's a political boundary doesn't mean that the ecosystems, of course, don't really care about that boundary. And so again, what is happening in this area of high seas with very limited governance does impact everything that's happening around it. And so I think about the high seas a lot. I work primarily in policy, although I do have a background in scientific research as well. But I want to take a second to just talk about what the high seas means. Again, so this is that area outside of the exclusive economic zones of any country. And an area of high seas, again, does mean that no country has jurisdiction, but specifically there are certain rights given to all countries in the planet equally in any area of high seas. The first that we all probably think about is transit. Any vessel is able to go across any area of high seas, and no other country can limit access to that area of high seas. You might notice the Central Arctic Ocean, though, is high seas surrounded by domestic waters, but there are things called international straits, of which the Bering Strait is one of them, which essentially act like high seas in terms of transit. So the US and Canada and Russia are not able to prevent any other nation's vessels from transiting across the Bering Strait into the Central Arctic Ocean. Of course, transit's one of them. Research, any nation is allowed to research any portion of high seas. Any nation is allowed to set undersea cables, is allowed to mine the deep sea bed of high seas. But what crucially came onto the scene first in the Central Arctic Ocean as the sea ice began to diminish was that any country is equally allowed to fish in the high seas. The Central Arctic Ocean was this space, again, that no one had fished before. And so there weren't any rules of the road because the idea of unregulated fishing, as we can all imagine, is not a good idea, and unsustainable harvests and unregulation can quickly diminish fish stocks, and people have figured this out for many decades. And so most areas of high seas that have commercially viable fish stocks are regulated by things called regional fisheries management organizations. They're international agreements that bring countries together to determine sustainable quota of fish, determining which nations get that fish, and managing that area of high seas in a way to make sure that the fish stocks remain and that the ecosystems remain healthy. The CAO did not have this, again, because there was no need to do that for most of human history. And so anticipating the fact that some nations have distant water fishing fleets, massive factory ships that can go up and traverse into the few bits of ice-free Arctic, again, really close to Alaska and Canada and Russia, like we saw how the sea ice is diminishing first. There was nothing stopping those nations from taking as much fish as they would want to in that area. The sea ice ecosystems, we don't understand much about them, but we do know that it is very delicate up there. We don't understand the impacts that commercial fishing would have. So in precautionary anticipation of the ecological disaster that unregulated fishing in the high seas of the Central Arctic Ocean would have had, 10 countries or 9 countries in the European Union came together to sign the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement. If you've been around any type of Arctic policy conference, which I understand I'm talking to scientists, but if you're around any conference of Arctic policy, the CAO Fisheries Agreement, or CAUFA, C-A-O-F-A, is talked about ad nauseum oftentimes because it does represent a new wave of doing international governance and resource management from a precautionary standpoint. So these 10 nations came together and enacted a 16-year moratorium on commercial fishing. Entered force in 2021, so that first 16-year moratorium will last until 2037, and it is able to be renewed on 5-year increments after that. It's one of the first times that nations have come together before industry has moved into a space and said, hey, we are going to not send industry in there so that we can understand and figure out how to do this in a sustainable and reasonable way. Notably in the Arctic too, is that this was the first agreement where Arctic and non-Arctic states became equal partners to a binding international agreement. The Arctic Council is often talked about in terms of the premier space for Arctic conversations and fora, and several agreements have been negotiated under the auspices of the Arctic Council. But nations like China, Japan, and even the many European Union nations and the UK, they are not voting members of the Arctic Council. They're only observers, so they have very limited influence. The Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement recognized that countries like Japan, Korea, the European Union, they, one, have equal claim to the fishery resources in the Central Arctic Ocean, but also they have become involved in Arctic affairs and continue to want to be involved in Arctic affairs. A couple years ago, China declared itself a near Arctic nation, so these countries are becoming more involved, and this agreement recognizes their interest in the Central Arctic Ocean and the Arctic in general, and really represents a new way of thinking about how to bring Arctic and non-Arctic states together at the same table to think about how to go about managing different industries in the Arctic. That's great, but what I really think is the crux of the fisheries agreement itself is, while it can be thought of as a conservation agreement, or it could be thought about as an international cooperation agreement or resource management agreement. At the core of it, it is a research agreement because what it says is we are banning fishing for 16 years so that we can do research. There's a robust research and monitoring program within the agreement to understand the impacts that commercial fishing might have. And crucially, also, it involves Indigenous people to a degree that has never been seen before in Arctic governance. So, 3 of the 10 nations, that's the US, Canada, and Denmark, have Indigenous people on their delegations, part of the decision making at the table. And part of the agreement mandates that co-production of knowledge be centered in the research and monitoring program, which I do want to talk about just a little bit more because I know I'm talking to a scientific audience. The Fisheries Agreement Joint Program of Scientific Research and Monitoring, you might see it called JPSRM. Policy is nothing if a fan of acronyms. Really does represent, again, a new way of thinking about how to collaboratively do research in the Arctic. A couple highlights of it. One is that it proceeds with an ecosystem-based approach. While the specific mandate of the agreement is on the high seas of the Central Arctic Ocean and focusing on fish, it is in the name of the agreement itself. The research and monitoring program recognizes that what happens to the fish impacts the rest of the Arctic Ocean. And so while there are priority species under the research and monitoring program that include all those potentially fish that might be commercially viable, marine mammals, seabirds, other species of fish, plankton, those are also all considered priority species to understand how do bringing in vessels to take fish out of the ecosystem, how does that impact the rest of the Arctic Ocean? And I really do mean the rest of the Arctic Ocean. While the agreement focuses on the high seas, the research and monitoring program focuses on 3 priority geographies. 1, the Central Arctic Ocean itself. 2, the surrounding waters. And 3, the Arctic gateways of the Bering Strait and the Fram Strait, recognizing especially that migratory species coming in crucially rely on that. And so impacts from vessels transiting there or impacts to the fisheries resources that they're traveling to get to have a much wider cascading impact than just in the high seas itself. A couple other things that the agreement and the research program calls out for is it does set up a way for nations to agree on sending joint expeditions into those 3 priority geographic regions. There are plenty of good research programs that want to study and are studying aspects of the Arctic, but it is difficult. And I know I don't have to tell anyone on that call. And so setting up a way for countries to collaborate, really synthesize their resources to understand the Arctic is really a crux of this. So much so that China did offer up to international scientists spaces on its ice-breaking research vessel, the Snow Dragon, coming up on one of their expeditions this year. That space and funding for that was offered within this program of scientific research and monitoring. And then lastly, I do just want to again highlight the fact that co-production of knowledge between science and Indigenous knowledge is a core of the agreement. The scientific coordinating group that oversees this program includes Indigenous knowledge holders, and they regularly attend and will be parts of those expeditions, not offering up their knowledge and synthesizing it with science. So that is a little bit about the agreement itself, and this research program does join a growing number of other research programs trying to learn more about the Central Arctic Ocean. So many of you may already know about the Mosaic expedition that happened 5 years ago, where they froze in and understood the ecosystems of the CAO. The Arctic Council's Protection of the Arctic Marine Environment has been working on a synthesis report on the CAO, which just came out last month. Again, this is the JPSRM will be functioning at least until 2037. Groups like Terra Ocean Foundation will be sending up their Terra Polar Station for at least 10 expeditions within the next 25 years. And then, of course, the International Polar Year is coming up in just a couple years in 2032 and 2033 alongside other domestic expeditions. So we are starting to understand more about the ecosystems of the Arctic, but it does take time. Industry, though, does not like to work on long terms. They like to work on shorter terms. And so while fisheries and fishing in the high seas of the Arctic was the first industry to look at the loss of sea ice as a potential opportunity to make money, there are other industries now as the sea ice continues to diminish that are also proposing operations in the Central Arctic Ocean, and for which there are also major policy gaps. So the first is what we probably all think about when we think about industry in the Arctic and in the high seas of the Arctic. It's shipping. So the idea of using the Arctic as a shortcut between the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean is absolutely not new. Explorers from Europe for centuries were pining after the Northwest Passage to use it as a way to cut out all that time that would take to go on other shipping routes. And while that has been of great interest for a long time, it has not come to fruition. This is a graphic of global container shipping, and we can see that global commerce goes around the Arctic. It does not go through it. Now, that's been simply because it's not been able to. It's been covered in that sea ice for most of human history. But you can see there's clear advantages, especially through Europe and Asia, to cut out a lot of that time by sending it through the Arctic. And as sea ice diminishes, the idea of using the Central Arctic Ocean as the world's quickest shortcut between the Pacific and the Atlantic becomes increasingly more interesting. Now, I want to point out that this is the transpolar shipping route, which uses the high seas of the Arctic. There are two other major shipping routes that are proposed or currently in use in the Arctic. There's the Northern Sea Route, which hugs the coast of Russia. That is currently in use at a small scale, mostly through liquefied natural gas, often from exports from Yamal over to China. And then, of course, there is the Northwest Passage, which transits the Canadian Arctic archipelago. Both of those routes, though, arguably are still within the national jurisdiction of Russia and Canada. So there are regulations that are in place, and it is up to Canada and Russia to determine how that shipping can be done sustainably, how it can be done safely, and how we can understand the impacts of that. That type of regulation, that type of knowledge and understanding does not exist for the Central Arctic Ocean and for the transpolar sea route. And there are some major impacts that come from shipping in the Arctic. One, the Central Arctic Ocean is the world's quietest sea. Again, that map previously shows that there are no commercial vessels transiting it. Noise is a huge issue when it comes to the communication of and the stress of marine species, particularly marine mammals. There are a lot of issues that come from the dumping of waste, and especially the idea of a catastrophic oil spill somewhere in the very remote part of the Central Arctic Ocean, thousands of miles from help. The way that the currents work could mean that that oil spreads across the Arctic and out through the Fram Strait. There is no infrastructure to support the use of the transpolar shipping route, yet that has not stopped countries and companies to consider it, and it is technically within their legal right to consider it. There is nothing stopping the most aggressive country or the most aggressive company for sending up a ship. They could send a ship tomorrow based on international law and go through the CAO. That's one of the industries, but the second one that is also being proposed and has been a very hot button topic recently is deep sea mining. So I will do a quick brief on deep sea mining because I realize that not everyone constantly looks up deep sea mining as much as I do. But first, talking about what the Central Arctic Ocean's seabed looks like, it is ripe for seabed mining. Deep sea mining, which is the process of collecting critical minerals from the seabed, focuses on three main geologic formations. The first is abyssal plains, where nodules of critical minerals form. The second is seamounts, which are undersea mountains, and the third is deep sea vents, which are undersea geysers. All three of those, which are the priority formations that seabed mining operations have been proposed for, are found in abundance in the Central Arctic Ocean. This red area right here is continental crust that is still within the high seas of the CAO. It's called the Chukchi Plateau, and it has been found to have a high amount of scandium as well, which could be one of the higher reserves in the planet. So there's a lot of interest in mining the seabed. But if you've heard anything about deep sea mining, you know that it's incredibly controversial. And that is because arguably there is no way to do it sustainably, and there is no way to do it that will not irrevocably damage marine ecosystems. The main proposed method for mining seabed is to send what is essentially a massive vacuum to scrape the seabed, which destroys benthic ecosystems and benthic species, to suck up those critical minerals, clean them in the ship, and then take all the sediments that came along with those minerals and then extrude them in a midwater plume. That brings up a lot of toxicity into the water column, as well as all of the noise that would come from all these operations, again, adding to the same issues we talked about when it came with shipping. And deep sea mining is regulated a little bit differently than transpolar shipping. I can go into this more if people have questions, but essentially, while any area of seabed outside of those 200 nautical miles is technically international seabed, meaning all countries have claims over it, if countries are able to prove that that seabed is an extension of their continental crust, they can make claims that is still part of their national jurisdiction. And as you can see in this map, in the Central Arctic Ocean, those claims are an absolute mess of overlapping, air quotes, sovereignty. There is about 99% of the CAO seabed is claimed by at least one nation. The only area which is considered international seabed, which means any country can mine it, is this small little black section, which corresponds to a portion of the Gackel Ridge. And interestingly enough, China has sent several research expeditions to understand the seabed in this space as well. So with the rise of these two new industries that also threaten the ecosystems of the Arctic and the people that rely upon those ecosystems, there has been recent call to build on the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement and apply its precautionary approach, apply its co-production mandate, and apply its incorporation of Indigenous people to these new industries. To that end, a letter from scientists concerning the Central Arctic Ocean was recently launched just a couple weeks ago. This is a picture of Henry Huntington, who is one of the letter's lead signers and a colleague of mine at Ocean Conservancy. And this is him announcing the letter at the UN Ocean Conference in Nice a couple weeks ago. And you'll notice that King Louis XIV was a very posh hotel, and so King Louis XIV is taking a look. But I do like to focus more so on the CAO because it's just, you know, King Louis had his time, and it's time to talk about the Arctic. This letter from scientists, which is still open for signature, anyone is still welcome to sign it, does call for a new international agreement for the Central Arctic Ocean to apply a precautionary pause to new industries similar to the Fisheries Agreement, and base that pause on Indigenous and scientific knowledge. Crucially, it also calls to continue building on those research programs that are trying to understand the Central Arctic Ocean and promote international cooperation around understanding those ecosystems and building the table for us to all have reasonable conversations. Like I mentioned, this letter is open to signature. Anyone is still welcome to sign. The requirement is just that you are a scientist. So happy to send the link around. We have this screenshot was taken yesterday, so we have over 1,100 signatures, and we're hoping to get to 2,000. Since notably, about 15 years ago, a very similar letter, also led by Henry and a coalition of scientists, which had about 2,000 signatures, which called for the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, was crucial in getting nations to see the need for adopting a precautionary approach. I know science letters are often, there are too many of them, and they can take up a lot of space, and there's skepticism of whether they are worth the time and effort. But I will say that the letter 15 years ago was essential in bringing attention and starting negotiations for the fisheries agreement. And we hope that this letter from scientists that was launched a couple weeks ago equally does build more momentum towards thinking about a precautionary approach to new industries in the Central Arctic Ocean. And then just a quick little look, because maps are fun, of where some of those 1,000+ signers are from. lots in Europe, lots in North America. And again, we're keeping this letter open, hopefully trying to get more signatures as well. And now this one talks just a little bit at the end. This is my last slide before questions. Is at Ocean Conservancy, we partner with Oceans North, which is a Canadian NGO, and Oceans North Kalalit Nunat, which is a Greenlandic NGO, on our efforts in the Central Arctic Ocean. And we are supporting this science letter from folks like Henry and other leading scientists as part of multi-pronged approach trying to get this new agreement. There are several other tools that we're using right now. You might see a citizens pledge going around, and there is a civil society letter for organizations to sign on as well. These are 3 tools for public awareness. We are continuing to have conversations with governments. We launched the letter at the UN Ocean Conference, like I mentioned, and we had several Arctic or Arctic interested nations like Korea in attendance and giving remarks as well, advocating for a precautionary pause to industries as well. So momentum is building, and hopefully will contribute again to building up research. The International Polar Year is coming up soon. Maybe this agreement, if we can get this, comes into play, so that we don't just have the fisheries agreement research program, but we also have another next generation research program able to really capitalize on the international attention on the poles, that'll be coming up in just a few years. So with that, though, I am happy to take any questions that anyone have. I can send along the link to the letter if people are interested, but really excited to answer any questions that might have come up.
Thank you so much. It's fascinating and really cool to see the work you're doing. Do we have any questions from